Taft and Buckley, Goldwater, Schlafly, Reagan, and Bush. He believes what they're really trying to do is to search for order in American politics. And he thinks that in most American history that's written, I wouldn't say all of it, but most American history that's written, historians tend to write about the struggle for equality. That tends to be the things that people focus on. There's an older school of historians known as the progressive historians who tended to write about this struggle for order. But what we have here, he believes, is this struggle for equality. Now with Taft, when we say the story starts with Taft, really what it begins with is with FDR. Because FDR, according to Farber, triggers the modern conservative movement. And what they're doing in the 1930s and the 1940s, when we first begin to see people calling themselves conservatives in American politics, that when we see this, they're really in reaction to FDR. Now Taft first used the term conservative in 1938 when he was running for the Senate. And it was a term that he clung to thereafter, and it came to refer to three principal themes that he supported. And that was support for property owners in particular, and economic liberty in general, against what he saw as an overbearing government. He was opposed to liberal intellectual elites and their desire to change U.S. society for the, quote, better. And although not paramount, he nevertheless took a racial outlook on U.S. society that emphasized qualities of what he called the Anglo-Saxon race. This has kind of continued, this Anglo-Saxon race idea. Later on, under other conservatives, it's called Christian heritage. And more recently, it's called the Judeo-Christian tradition. But it's the same kind of concept that's running through this. Individual responsibility and ingenuity were the keys to the success of American society. Claiming hardship because of class or race for Taft was only directing energies down a bad and ill-chosen path and opening doors to let in new forms of tyranny. This led him to oppose U.S. involvement in World War II, a position that really kept him out of the presidency because he did try to become president several times. It was not for Americans to fight for the freedom of others, and neither did economics require U.S. intervention abroad. This put him out of step with many of his business supporters, because often business supporters have seen intervention abroad in the purpose of opening markets as a good thing. But he regained a lot of his lost ground inside the conservative world by his anti-union legislation, the Taft-Hartley Act that bears his name of 1947, that in many ways reined back what had been passed under Roosevelt in the National Labor Relations Act. But even as he remained an outsider in the party, in the Republican Party, he was unable to combine his conservative message with a campaign that would convince the public to accept him as a Republican candidate for the presidency. In his last attempt, this is clear what happens to him in 1952 when he runs for president against Eisenhower. Eisenhower is seen as an internationalist, and that's really what sinks Taft. Time and again, they brought up these statements in the 1930s when Taft was saying the United States should stay out of the war. Okay, post-war, those are seen as naive things and not popular things to have been said. So one thing about Farber, I have to say, is that he works really hard in this book to be even-handed. Often, you know, the very story itself seems to be highly critical of these conservatives and these Republicans for the most part. But in some situations, it seems like shooting fish in a barrel, really. But he manages to hold back, and he's not as critical as he could be. And that's maybe a positive thing. It allows him to certainly sound more balanced in this. Now, one of the things that does emerge from this argument is it seems to me that over the course of 3/4 of the century, there's much less to conservatism than meets the eye. It's not really this deep, thoughtful, complex conception of the world. Economically, the conservatives offered little more than an updated free market fundamentalism. stepping back to the 19th century. Socially, they clung to notions of family, tradition, and institutional obedience that often were just seen as nostalgic. Even backward in some cases. Conservatism, as Farber depicts it, is not a movement of big ideas. The one person he admits is pretty intellectually accomplished is William Buckley. He's one of the people who is pictured in here. But even him, he says that this isn't so much that he's a deep thinker, but that William Buckley is very clever. And often he wrote polemics. That's what he was most powerful at. Nothing, according to Farber, and I certainly can't think of anything that Buckley wrote that stands out in my mind. Nothing he wrote stands as enduring or has anything more than artificial value. At his best, he just seems to be clever. For example, Buckley offers these what seems to be heartfelt condemnations of white Southern violence, while defending at the same time, simultaneously, the notions of white rights. It seems intellectually dishonest to be doing these two things at the same time. Perhaps this is a sort of joke that Farber makes, but Buckley wouldn't have himself burned heretics at the stake, but he would have penned eloquent defenses of the practice. Now, Farber then turns his attention to Barry Goldwater. Goldwater, it seems to be really quite a turning point in this whole story. He's pummeled at the polls in 1964, the Johnson landslide. And what this really seems to do, this seems to be the last hurrah of a New Deal coalition that's still intact. Okay, what happens in the 1960s is between racial riots and the war in Vietnam, the coalition begins to fall apart. But in '64, this coalition runs over Goldwater. One of the interesting things that he brings out in this is the South at this time. I'm going to talk about another book here briefly, but the South during this time was actually solidly Democratic. Historians and political scientists remember this, but now people just simply assume that it's always been the solidly conservative Republican bastion. It changes during this period. And one of the things that happens, and one of the people who's key in this thing, is Barry Goldwater. Because during that '64 campaign, he campaigned in the South. And while the growth of the big northern cities during World War II had caused the Democratic Party, the power of the Democratic Party to begin to be centered on those northern cities and leaving the South behind, what happens is when he campaigns in the South, when Goldwater campaigns in the South, what they discover is that he's talking about stuff that they agree with, and he's a Republican. Okay, he's the one who plants the seed that makes this transformation possible. And then, of course, what happens later under Johnson, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and given the seed that Goldwater had planted during the campaign, what happens is the South switches in reaction and in a way to resist the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So Goldwater is a key figure here. The next person that he talks about, of course, is Phyllis Schlafly. Again, this word I have trouble with. But I was kind of surprised to see her there. I have these memories of her working against the Equal Rights Amendment in the '70s. But he makes a good case that she is the person who kept the light burning of conservatism during this period, kind of between Goldwater and Reagan. She is the one who transforms a lot of the dialogue that emphasizes states' rights. That is, that this thing ought not to be forced down states' throats.